Hello friends, my name is Daria and I'm a watercolor artist. On my channel you'll find many videos about watercolor techniques and more. In this video, we'll talk about the essential color set every watercolor artist needs, which can help in almost any situation. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Let's get started. I've already made a few videos about selecting materials for watercolor. You can find these videos in my Watercolor Materials playlist, and the link will be in the video description or somewhere here on the screen. In today's video, we'll specifically talk about the minimal color palette you need to paint a wide range of pictures without limitations. To better understand this concept, not just memorize it, let's refer to the color wheel. I'm drawing it on the screen right now. If you've never used a color wheel before, it's easy to find it by searching color wheel online. What's important to understand is that colors don't exist in isolation, they gradually flow into one another. You can clearly see this when you arrange them in a proper circle. The key idea is understanding how each colour transitions into the next. You might be familiar with the children's rhyme about the colours of the rainbow, which can help us as well. It's a natural sequence of colours, transitioning smoothly from one to another. In painting, we use three primary colours: blue, yellow and red. But in watercolour and other artistic mediums, we actually use a cooler, pinkish red, known as magenta in digital formats. Using only these three colours can be quite limiting, and your work might lose some vibrancy because we're working with real pigments, not synthetic or digital ones. However, we don't need a lot of colours. I'll suggest 8 colours that will be more than enough to expand our palette beyond the 3 primary colours. We don't need secondary colours. Those are created by mixing blue and yellow, red and yellow and so on, like green, purple and orange. I won't be including green or purple in this basic palette, and I'll explain why later. We also need to understand warm and cool colours to make our palette versatile enough to handle different tasks. The colour wheel can be divided into 2 parts. Colours near orange, like yellow and red, are considered warm, while colours near blue, like green and purple, are cooler. This division is relative, though. For example, within the red spectrum, you can find both warm and cool shades. The same applies to green. Emerald green is cooler than yellow green. To create a rich palette, we'll need warm and cool shades of the basic colours, blue and red. I'll also explain the exception when it comes to yellow later. To understand which colour is warm and which is cool, here's a simple exercise. You can paint swatches of the colours you have onto small cards and arrange them according to a colour wheel. I recommend it to everyone starting out. It really helps you see the relationships between colours, what is warmer or cooler, and how they interact. For example, within the red family, cadmium red is warm, and of course, cadmium orange is even warmer. Orange is unique because it has no cool shades. Blue, on the other hand, can be both warm and cool. Now, take a look at your muted colours. We'll talk more about them later, but at this stage, you can categorise them. Do they lean towards yellow or appear cooler and greyer? For example, black tends to have a bluish tone, and you'd likely mix it using blue as a base. Some muted colours might lean towards green. For example, I have a colour called green earth, which is an interesting swampy shade. There are also cool and warm greyish blues. You can perform this exercise with all your colours, but I won't spend too much time on each one here. I'll focus on assembling a set of warm and cool tones for each primary colour. Even yellow has warm and cool variations. Lemon yellow is typically cool, while cadmium yellow is considered warm. However, the difference between these two yellows is quite subtle. Including two yellows in your minimal palette might not be efficient. Orange, like cadmium orange, is much more versatile, especially when mixed with carmine to create rich red and orange shades. Next, I suggest using cadmium red and carmine, or other variations of warm and cool reds, to give you a wide range of red shades to play with. In the palette, I also include phthalo blue and ultramarine. Aside from being warm and cool blues, they also differ in pigment density. Carmine and cadmium red are both warm colours with dense, heavy pigments. Phthalo blue and bright blue from Nevskaya Palitra have light, transparent pigments that create clean, vivid colours and clear, active mixes. Ultramarine, on the other hand, produces heavier, slightly muted mixes, but sometimes that's exactly what you need for a more interesting result. Finally, I add ochre and burnt sienna to the palette. These are two basic popular browns. I always include ochre because it doesn't have many equivalents, but burnt sienna can be substituted with other reddish browns like English red, chestnut, or Mars red. The difference between these browns is why I include them in the basic palette. Muted browns are great not only on their own, but also in mixes. For example, you can create rich, dark, almost black shades by mixing burnt sienna and ultramarine. Depending on the concentration, these mixes can be warmer or cooler. Ochre, on the other hand, produces lighter, more complex tones, sometimes with a greenish tint. Although muted might sound like a negative term, it's quite useful. But in reality, we often don't need those bright, synthetic shades. More often, we need a warm, slightly muted colour. In landscapes especially, you rarely find these pure, vibrant colours, maybe only in flowers or very saturated fruits. If you look at these two colours, ochre is a yellowish shade, similar to yellow, but it creates more muted tones. Burnt sienna or similar reddish browns are closer to red. For example, mixing ultramarine, blue, with sienna, the shade leans towards violet. If you test your reddish browns, you'll notice that the intensity of the violet tint varies depending on how red the colour is. Now, I recommend watching as I work on a complex, multicoloured reference to test this palette that I suggested to you. I'm seeing how far I can get with it while working on such a bright, vivid piece. Here, I'm painting a market stall with grapes in various colours and a bright umbrella above them. It's a very colourful piece, but I'm using only the colours I recommended: yellow, cadmium orange, cadmium red, carmine, ochre, burnt sienna, ultramarine, and phthalo blue. I've already finished the background, where ultramarine is clearly visible, along with a bluish sign in the distance, for which I used phthalo blue. Now I'm painting yellow grapes. I need a clean colour, so I'm using phthalo blue instead of ultramarine to achieve a more transparent pigment. However, I added a touch of ochre to make the colour more complex and natural. This gives me a rich yet natural greenish-yellow tone for the grapes. I also added drops of cadmium red in some places. Unlike yellow, where the difference between warm and cool is subtle, with red, the difference between warm and cool shades is much more noticeable. For example, if you mix yellow with carmine, it will look entirely different from mixing it with cadmium red or another warm red. There aren't many warm reds, but there's also cyan red. And I've seen some medium shades of red that can be hard to classify as warm or cool. However, if you have cadmium orange, you can stick with just one cool red. For a long time I used this option, but recently I've been using a wider range of reds, especially in washes, for greater variety. For the wooden boxes, I'm using ochre with a touch of a warmer reddish tone, while leaving some streaks of ultramarine to create cooler areas. As you can see, I don't have purple or green in my palette, but I do have orange. Why? Because both purple and green can be beautifully and easily mixed from their corresponding pairs, but mixing a vibrant, interesting orange is actually quite difficult. It tends to turn out dull. On the other hand, pre-mixed greens and purples are often available, and many purples in particular aren't very light fast. You can see this on the packaging marked with stars. This means that the colour might fade over time. I personally haven't experienced this yet. Maybe my works just haven't been around long enough. But ideally, we want the colours to stay vibrant. Additionally, both green and purple, in their pure store-bought forms, are often overly synthetic and bright. They usually need to be toned down. You can often spot beginners' work by the greens they use, like the greens from Nevskaya Palitra, such as dark green or May green. These colours stand out because they don't look natural without some mixing. The same goes for purples, especially in skies. Pure purple can be so intense that it can ruin the whole sky. It's rare to need a true purple, maybe in botanical illustrations with flowers like bluebells. Even with purple berries, the colour leans more toward blue than purple. So, while you can use store-bought greens and purples, they often need mixing to create a more appealing effect. Cadmium orange, on the other hand, is a vivid, juicy colour that is often useful in its pure form. It's great for fruits like oranges, autumn leaves, and sunset skies. That's why I prioritise orange over green and purple. My painting is almost done. Lastly, there's one more colour I haven't included in the beginner palette, and I'll explain why. Titanium white isn't typically used in traditional watercolour, and it's often discouraged in classical watercolour education. I wouldn't recommend beginners rely on titanium white, as it can take away from the true qualities of watercolour. However, sometimes you might want to add small highlights where it wasn't possible to leave white space. In those cases, a bit of titanium white can help, but remember that your whitest white is the paper itself. No paint can match that. That's all for today. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. See you in the next video. Bye.